Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Realizing Sustainable Bioenergy Pathways Towards Climate Goals session of the IEA Bioenergy Conference 2021 edition. I'm Glaucia Souza from the University of São Paulo and FAPESP Bioenergy Research Program BioEN and National Team Leader of Tasks 45 and 39. I have here helping in the background my co-chair Gustav Engel from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. The session brings together experts that will present important data on implementation and scaling up of bioenergy to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and help climate change mitigation efforts. We will have panelists addressing sustainable land use, sustainable feedstock supply security, biomass quantification, forest resources, governance, and other issues. Throughout the session, we ask you to post questions in the Q&A in your screen. We also have surveys set up to collect the views from our audience. If the host could kindly put the first one up. So the first survey, in your country, what do you think most contributes to delaying the growth of bioenergy? You can select up to 3 issues. The poll will be up for the first half of the session. We will announce the results mid-session. And we will answer questions also in the end of the session. So I hope you can keep up with us towards the end of the session for the Q&A. We have with us today participants and collaborators of Task 45, the IEA Bioenergy task that works on climate and sustainability, effects of bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy. This task is trying to identify and address critical issues related to the climate and other sustainability effects of bioenergy, bio-based products and systems. It is great to have you all here to engage with us in this important discussion. Let me introduce you our first speaker. Bruno Gagnon is a senior science and policy analyst in the Canadian Forest Service at Natural Resources Canada and national task leader of IEA Task 43 on biomass supply. He will talk about contribution of bioenergy systems to sustainable development goals. Bruno, this is a very important issue, especially in developing nations grappling with inequality and their need to grow sustainably. You have the word.
Thank you very much, Glaucia, for this introduction. Let me just pull up the presentation for today. Can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay.
Good. I also want to thank participants for taking the time in their busy schedules to attend this session at the IEA Bioenergy Conference 2021. Today, I'll be presenting some of the outcomes of work we did under myself and other IEA Bioenergy colleagues under the Strategic Intertask Project on Bioenergy in a well below 2 degree and sustainable development goals world. So this might seem a bit unusual, but I'll start right away with the key messages for my presentation. Please have them in mind as we go through the next slides together. So first, bioenergy and its associated biomass supply chains go beyond SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy. They can relate to all SDGs. Priority SDGs can vary by supply chain type, geography, and even from one system to another. Contribution of bioenergy systems to SDGs can either be positive or negative. and best practices coupled with modern technology can minimize adverse impacts and maximize co-benefits. So what exactly are the Sustainable Development Goals? So in case you're not familiar with them, they were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In total, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. I find it useful to present them following the three well-known pillars of sustainable development, which are biosphere, or environment, society, and economy. But please keep in mind that a single SDG can relate to more than one pillar. So under biosphere, we find 4 SDGs that relate to water issues, climate, aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. If we add another layer, then we see that almost half of the SDGs closely relate to society. Here we have issues like poverty, hunger, well-being, education, gender equality, clean energy, sustainable cities, and peace and justice. Another set of SDGs are linked to economic goals, which can be work and growth, industry and innovation, inequalities, as well as responsible consumption and production. Lastly, SDG 17 plays an overarching role and addresses how partnerships between countries can support progress globally. So I'm sure you're asking yourself then, which SDGs are most likely to be linked to bioenergy systems than others? Well, first, obviously, SDG 7 is the one that clearly relates to clean energy, but there are relationships that can be tied with all the other SDGs as well. So what we did was a scan of literature for studies that drew explicit linkages between bioenergy or biomass supply chains and SDGs. Several studies were identified that provided a high-level overview of the possible ways that bioenergy could impact SDGs globally. So in addition to SDG 7 on clean and affordable energy, climate change, sustainable industry, and economic growth were also part of the SDGs that were more likely to be linked to bioenergy. So here you see on the slide that those would fall under the high likelihood of interaction category. Other SDGs are also usually considered to have a moderate or low likelihood of interaction in general. And here you see them as well on the screen. But it's also crucial to keep in mind that actual impacts are really location and supply chain specific. So even though in general, an SDG like SDG 4 on education doesn't show up as one that's closely linked or linked in general to bioenergy systems, for a given case, it can actually be quite an important SDG. We also looked at the literature to learn more about the actual sustainability impacts of biomass production systems and bioenergy. So what we found is that those impacts varied between supply chain types, and there were documented occurrences of positive and negative interactions for most SDGs. Furthermore, we also realized that some SDGs were more closely related to the generation of bioenergy itself, while others were more closely related to upstream activities around biomass supply and had a greater influence around those activity types. So last June, IEA Bioenergy, in collaboration with the Global Bioenergy Partnership, or GBEP, hosted a workshop to hear from experts around the world on biomass supply and SDGs. The objectives of the workshops were to explore the importance of SDGs for biomass supply chains, share best practices amongst experts, and also explore how governance can help align biomass supply chain with the SDGs. So one thing we asked the experts was to tell us which SDGs were more likely to be related, either positively or negatively, to the three main types of biomass, which are agricultural, forest, and waste. So without going into every little detail, because the workshop report will provide that information, here are a few elements that stood out for agricultural feedstocks. First, practices such as fertilizer application or tillage can either reduce or increase both GHG emissions and soil carbon. So a clear interaction with climate action, SDG 13, both for the positive and negative aspects. Use of residues can help diversify markets and increase revenues. And how you select crops, whether or not they need a lot of water or fertilizers, will exacerbate or can exacerbate water pollution and scarcity. So with clear interactions with SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. For forest feedstocks, you see some similar SDGs, but also differences. So what we've heard was that rural and remote areas can greatly benefit from utilization of locally available resources as a way to alleviate poverty and generate development opportunities. The effects on climate and ecosystems really depend on whether or not sustainable forest management practices are implemented. So clear ties to SDG 13 on climate and SDG 15 on life on land. And then traditional uses of biomass can have clear negative impacts on human health, so tied to SDG 3. Lastly, in the case of waste, the benefits are multiplied when a waste disposition problem is solved at the same time as meeting a demand for clean energy. If waste is not handled properly, whether it's used for energy or not, it can have negative impacts on both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So SDG 6 and 15. And there are clear climate benefits when you avoid disposing of a waste in a way that causes GHG emissions. So clear links to SDG 13 on climate action. So after having identified and characterized all the possible interactions between biomass production systems and SDGs, we sought to assemble a collection of best practice case studies from around the world, from different supply chains and at different scales. We wanted to show how biomass production can be increased in a way that provided positive impacts while minimizing negative impacts on society and ecosystems. So we collected a total of 37 case studies, a majority in North America and Europe, but also a significant number in South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Most of the case studies were taken from recent work undertaken under IEA Bioenergy or GBEP, but we also did reach out to the original authors to validate that the relations we drew ourselves with the SDGs were accurate and representative of their own work. So looking at the contribution of SDGs across the different case studies, and here you see a summary by supply chain type for each SDG from 1 to 15. We saw that the case studies that indicated multiple positive impacts on SDGs from bioenergy projects when best practices are implemented along the supply chains. Often the motivation for implementation of bioenergy projects and new biomass production systems were not necessarily energy or climate related, but also tied to other SDGs as important drivers. In several cases, potential negative impacts were noted, but there were safeguards in place to prevent those negative impacts to be significant. While all cases were unique, there were some common themes amongst them, namely that biomass production systems were integrated into land and resource management systems in a way that complements and not compete with other production systems, and would involve close cooperation and partnerships between stakeholders along the supply chain. So some of what I presented might seem a bit abstract to you, and I wanted to provide a closer look to one of the case studies that we documented in our report, and one I know best personally. It describes the activity of Agfor, a forest company that operates in Eastern Canada, in the province of New Brunswick, as you see on the map. Agfor works with private woodlot owners with lots ranging from 20 to 500 hectares, and they harvest trees using mostly selective harvesting and commercial thinning. The harvested trees are used for lumber, pulp, panels, but also bioenergy. Parts of the harvested trees are dedicated to bioenergy and are either chipped and used in boilers or split for firewood and used in wood stoves. The supply chain goes from the harvesting and collection of the biomass all the way to the use of bioenergy. So it's an integrated supply chain model. We documented significant interactions with 6 out of the 17 SDGs, and I'll say a few words on each of those. So first, reliance on fossil fuels is reduced as wood chips are fed into biomass boilers to supply heat to schools, hospitals, and municipal buildings in Eastern Canada provinces. You can see on the picture on your right, a boiler installed in Moncton, New Brunswick, that displaces a carbon-intensive energy source, which is fuel oil, hence reducing the carbon footprint of heat generation in the region. Harvest operations conducted by Agfor also leave standing higher value trees such as white pine and red maple to continue growing, and selectively harvest intolerant or lower value trees such as balsam fir and aspen for different applications, including bioenergy production. So the company harvests around 50,000 cubic meters of trees annually, with 2/3 being softwood trees and the other third being hardwood. Their business model is really anchored in having an outlet for smaller diameter logs that cannot be used for either lumber, pulp, or panels, and allows them to generate revenues to make their operations more profitable, while improving the quality of the stands in the region. For SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities, the modern boilers installed have very low atmospheric emissions and achieve better performance than conventional wood stoves. Those are EN 303-5 certified boilers manufactured in Europe. The fact that Agfor is responsible for harvesting, storing, shipping the biomass, in addition to delivering the wood chips and operating the boilers, ensures high quality fuel from beginning to end of the supply chain and optimal operation of the equipment. So in conclusion, going back to the key messages I provided at the beginning of the presentation, bioenergy goes well beyond SDG 7 and can relate to all, if not most, SDGs. Co-benefits are as important, in some situations even more important than clean energy itself. Priority SDGs will vary from case to case, and I presented one today at the conference. Certain interactions are more common, but there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and every system will be different. Contribution to SDGs can either be positive or negative, but bioenergy done right has a role in the low carbon transition, as you will hear more about today. And best practices and modern technology make a difference, and they can be enabled by appropriate governance frameworks, which is also a topic of the session today. So thank you for your attention, and I will remain available to answer any questions you might ask in the Q&A box or during the discussion later today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. I want to remind you all that it's time to answer your survey. We have a survey up if you haven't answered yet. And please post your questions in the Q&A box, okay? Our next speaker is Floor van der Hilst. She's an associate professor in the university in the Energy and Resources Group of the Copernicus Institute of Utrecht University, the Netherlands. Floor is the co-chair of IEA Bioenergy Task 45 on the sustainability of bioenergy. She will talk about land use for bioenergy, synergies and trade-offs, a very important issue on the decision-making process. Floor is having connection problems and sent us a recording. Thank you very much, Floor. And she will be presenting live in the Q&A session.
Good evening to you all. Also in my presentation, I will focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. But specifically, we will look into the synergies and trade-offs between the SDGs of using land for dedicated energy crop production. Before I start, I would like to highlight that I'm the one presenting this work, but that this work is a joint effort of many people from both Task 45 and beyond. It's the work of 90 co-authors of all around the globe. Especially I would like to mention Ivan Vera, who has done the heavy lifting in this study. If we want to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, which have been reconfirmed at COP26 in Glasgow last month, and we want to keep global temperature rise well below 2 degrees, preferably the 1.5 degree, we need deep greenhouse gas emission reductions and also negative emissions. Biomass expect to play an important role in meeting these targets. This was also highlighted again yesterday in the keynote of Andy Rising in the opening session, who stated that we just cannot afford not to use bioenergy. However, there are major concerns when it comes to sustainability of bioenergy. First of all, there are concerns that bioenergy can increase greenhouse gas emissions instead of reducing them compared to the fossil counterparts. And secondly, there are concerns that there are potentially negative effects on other sustainable development goals. On the other hand, bioenergy can also result in positive effects on the SDGs. The large majority of the sustainability concerns, such as the impact on carbon stocks, biodiversity, food security, are all related to the use of land for dedicated crops. And that's the reason why we specifically focus on the land use aspect of bioenergy. And also because land in general plays a critical role in meeting the SDGs. And land is a finite resource, so we need to use land wisely. For example, the afolu sector is responsible for 23% of the greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of the freshwater use, and is a key contributor to the biodiversity loss. The increased demand for food and climate change will worsen these problems. Squeezing bioenergy into this already quite crowded equation could easily lead to negative impacts on the SDGs. However, we don't want bioenergy to be part of the problem. We want it to be part of the solution. So therefore, we need to strive for synergies between the impacts on the SDGs. These synergies and trade-offs of bioenergy have often been mentioned. Also yesterday in the opening session, it was highlighted again. And there is, of course, consensus that we need to strive for these win-win situations and to avoid trade-offs. However, whether land use for dedicated energy crops results in synergies between the SDGs or trade-offs highly depends on what we call contextual factors or contextual conditions. Think about what kind of energy crop we use, what type of land use is converted to energy crops, what are the climate and soil conditions, for example. So several studies have looked into specific synergies or specific trade-offs for very specific case studies. However, there's a lack of overview about the key reasons why synergies and trade-offs will occur. So we now have made an overview of the synergies and trade-offs found in literature and identified the context-specific factors affecting or determining these synergies and trade-offs. With this, we can come to more generalizable lessons on synergies and trade-offs of land use for bioenergy. This can help us to have better informed decision-making on sustainable land use and sound implementation of dedicated energy crops in the landscape. As the key driver for the employment of bioenergy is greenhouse gas emission reduction, we specifically assess the trade-offs between greenhouse gas emission reduction, so SDG 13, climate action, and the other SDGs. In total, we have found 427 observations, of which 170 synergies, 176 trade-offs, and 81 no effects between SDG 13, climate action, and the other SDGs. The no effect means that the relation has been studied, but no evidence of the synergistic or trade-off has been found. We should be careful here with the interpretation of these numbers, because this just represents a count of the number of times that the synergy or trade-off is found in literature. It doesn't say anything about the severity or the intensity of the relation. There could be very well synergies or trade-offs between the SDGs that have just not been studied yet, or a relation, synergy, or a trade-off that has been found often in the literature but is not that strong. We see that there are a lot of synergies and trade-offs are reported between greenhouse gas emission reduction, so SDG 13, and clean water and sanitation, so SDG 6, and life on land, 15. For almost all SDGs, we see that both synergies and trade-offs are reported. For the synergies and trade-offs found between SDG 13, climate action, and life on land, we see mostly synergies when it relates to soil quality. So, for example, increase in soil organic carbon and a decrease in soil erosion risk. Both synergies and trade-offs were found when it comes to biodiversity, and mostly or only trade-offs were found with forest conservation. For the synergies and trade-offs found between greenhouse gas emission reduction and other targets of the SDG 13, we mostly see synergies, for example with the albedo effect and also with adaptation, for example flood prevention. For the synergies and trade-offs found between SDG 13 and clean water and sanitation, we found mostly synergies when it comes to water quality, mostly due to lower nutrient requirements of perennial crops, for example. We found mostly trade-offs when it comes to water availability due to the high water requirements of fast-growing species and due to water access of deep-rooted species. For the synergies and trade-offs found with SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, we saw mostly trade-off when it comes to farmers' income, because bioenergy is just not competitive yet with fossil alternative and therefore feedstock prices are low. We found mostly synergies when it comes to employment, especially in the rural areas. For the synergies and trade-offs found between SDG 13 and good health and well-being, we found few synergies and trade-offs, but mostly synergies that are related to the aesthetics and the recreational value of the landscape. For the synergies and trade-offs with zero hunger, so SDG 2, we found mostly trade-offs, and those are all related to the competition for lands. So for most SDGs, we found both synergies and trade-offs. Whether a synergy or trade-off occurs depends on the context-specific conditions. In our study, we focused on previous land use type, feedstock type, and climate and soil conditions. We found much more information for the environment-related SDGs, so life on land, clean water and sanitation, and climate action. So we focused on the synergies and trade-offs between these SDGs and the factors affecting whether this is a synergy or a trade-off. So for the other SDGs, we simply didn't have sufficient information to differentiate for the contextual factors. Here we see the overview of the synergies and trade-offs between SDG 13, climate action, and the other SDGs, plotted according to previous land uses. So the land use that has been converted to the dedicated energy crop. So you see that on the left-hand side. The positive numbers indicate synergies and the negative numbers indicate trade-offs. And the color indicates the type of synergy with the type of SDG. We see many synergies reported for the case that arable land is converted to energy crop production. However, this is only on the field level, so it is only when no indirect effects are taken into account. What we can take away from this figure is that we see more synergies than trade-offs when managed land is converted to dedicated energy crops, and we see much more trade-offs when natural land is used for energy crop. Here we see the overview of the synergies and trade-offs between SDG 13 and the other SDGs, plotted according to the feedstock type. So on the left-hand side, you see the different feedstock types. We see for annual crops, oil palm and also sugarcane, we find mostly trade-offs. When it comes to perennial grasses, short rotation coppers and forestry, we see both synergies and trade-offs, a bit more synergies. Whether a synergy or trade-off occurs also depends on the other contextual specific conditions, such as the previous land use and the climate and soil conditions. Here we see the overview of the synergies and trade-offs between SDG 13 and the other SDGs, plotted according to the climate conditions. So on the left-hand side, you see the different climate regions, and the top one says scale, and that means that the case of the region included multiple climate regions. So for example, a global study or a large regional study. We found more synergies than trade-offs in cool and warm temperate, and we found more trade-offs in tropical regions. But it has also, of course, to do with the previous land use and the feedstock type. For example, in tropical regions, more old palm and sugarcane are cultivated, and in temperate regions, more short rotation coffees are cultivated, for example. So this was just a very brief overview of the results. So what we can conclude is that we found more or less an equal amount of synergies and trade-offs. However, whether the synergies or trade-offs occur highly depend on the contextual factors. What we have found is that there are mostly synergies when we use marginal land for perennial energy crops in temperate regions, in areas with a clay soil. We found mostly trade-offs when any natural vegetation, so not just forest, but any, is converted to any type of energy crop. So disregarding the feedstock type, the climate region, or the soil type. So therefore, the conversion of natural vegetation needs to be avoided. More synergies were found for good health and well-being, climate action and life on land. But for zero hunger, clean water and sanitation, and decent work and economic growth, more trade-offs were found. So if we want to maximize the synergies and avoid the trade-offs, we need to take these contextual factors into account. So this study was a very good first step to get a better overview of the synergies and trade-offs found when land is dedicated to energy crops, and the factors that determining these synergies and trade-offs. However, follow-up research is required. As we have seen, the research scale really matters. So if we look at a field level, maybe positive effects occur when we use, for example, arable land for our dedicated energy crops. But then if we have large-scale implementation on a global level, this can result in large negative impacts, of course. Also, the time dimension is important to consider. Sometimes impacts only occur when with a time lag, for example, the timing of emissions or the remigration of species. Furthermore, the impact of land use are really the result of the interplay of various land uses. Therefore, we shouldn't just focus on the sustainability of bioenergy in isolation, but we should assess that in the context of all other land uses. Also, we would like to work more on the quantification of these trade-offs. So, for example, how many species are lost for the gain of 1 ton of carbon? So, all of this would help to better understand the synergies and trade-off and will enable us to have more informed decision-making on sustainable land use. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Floor. We will see you in the Q&A session. I remind the audience to post their questions in the Q&A box. Our next speaker is Annette Cowie. Annette is a principal research scientist at the NSW Department of Primary Industry, Australia. She's currently co-leader in the IEA Bioenergy Group Climate and Sustainability Effects of Bioenergy within the broader Bioeconomy, Task 45. She will talk about how sustainable forest bioenergy contributes to climate goals. Annette has been very active and doing quite a lot of research on forestry and bioenergy. So Annette, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Glaucia. Hopefully in a moment you will see my screen. Can someone confirm if you can see my screen, please? Yes. Great. Thank you. So first I'd like to thank Glaucia and thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about this important topic of how forest-based bioenergy can contribute to climate change mitigation. Before I get into it, I'd like to acknowledge the contributors to this work, most particularly Jørgen Benders, who's the leader of our task, and also various others from the task who have contributed to this work, contributed multiple reports, etc., that are behind this. So just last August, the IPCC released the first volume of their 6th assessment report. Volume 1 focuses on the evidence and the physical impacts of climate change. Incidentally, in case you're wondering why it's Volume 1, the IPCC assessment reports actually comprise 3 volumes, and the other 2 volumes that look at climate change adaptation and mitigation, respectively, are due for release in about March next year. So the first volume, the Working Group 1 report, demonstrated what we already know. Climate change is all around us. Climate change has already caused over 1 degree of warming from our human activities. And in fact, in Australia, it's up to 1.5 degrees because it tends to be higher over the continents than it is over the oceans. In fact, each of the past 4 decades has been the warmest on record since pre-industrial times. And now, unfortunately, we have an over 50% chance that we'll cross that 1.5 degree threshold in the early 2030s. So unless there is immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees really will be beyond reach. However, if we do manage to achieve that rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and then it is actually likely that we could limit warming to 2 degrees, the upper bound of the Paris Agreement. The Working Group 1 report demonstrates very clearly that there's a strong linear relationship between CO2 emissions and global warming. So the most important climate action is to stop emitting CO2. You will have heard, no doubt, that the Paris Agreement also talks about the net zero goal. It identifies that to meet the temperature goal, the world will need to reach net zero in the second half of the century. So net zero is a condition where the greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by greenhouse gas removals. And that essentially means carbon sequestration. And there are several ways that bioenergy can contribute to achieving this balance. The first is using biomass for bioenergy as a renewable energy source that can displace fossil fuels. Biomass is essentially a carbon neutral energy source as long as the biomass is regrown after harvest, apart from fossil fuels used in the supply chain. That's why I say mostly there. Of course, burning biomass emits CO2 just the same as burning coal emits CO2. The CO2 is the same. So at the point of combustion, the key difference between bioenergy and fossil fuel is that bioenergy operates within the short-term carbon cycle. As long as the biomass is regrown, it's taken back out of the atmosphere in the short term. Whereas the fossil energy systems transfer carbon from where it was safely stored underground to the atmosphere, where it essentially causes permanent warming. As you'd no doubt be aware, there are a range of different technologies for the production of bioenergy, a range of different products that can be produced, from heat to electricity, to liquid fuels and biogas. And it can be done at a wide range of scales, from as small as a cook stove through to plants that process tonnes per hour. The emissions savings are different between those different options. Generally, the emissions savings are greatest for heat applications, intermediate for electricity, and lower for biofuels from lignocellulosic biomass, for example. Now, in Australia, people forget bioenergy. When they think of renewable fuels, they think just of wind and solar. But bioenergy can play a critical role in supporting the transformation of the energy sector towards 100% renewables. Because bioenergy is storable and dispatchable, it can stabilise the grid and allow more rapid penetration of the intermittent renewables, wind and solar. This study done in Australia showed exactly this. In green, we see the biomass contributing to the energy supply. And it's very important in winter when we have less solar and wind resources. And if you have some bioenergy in the mix, this study showed that you can reduce the levelized cost of electricity because you need less installed capacity for your wind and solar resources. Now, it's important to remember that forest-based biomass is not usually the only product from a forest operation. Usually forests are grown for the timber products, and the biomass is in fact a co-product of that whole exercise. So if you use timber products, you continue to store the carbon in those building products, for example. And in addition, they displace fossil fuel emissions by displacing more greenhouse gas intensive building products such as concrete, steel, and aluminium. This study from the state of New South Wales by one of my colleagues, Fabiana Ximenez, contrasted the climate effects of continuing to harvest our native forests, which are managed for timber production, or alternatively ceasing harvest of the forests. Ceasing harvest is shown in the black line. And what this study showed was that when you consider the combined effect of the carbon in the forest in green, plus the products in service and those in landfill, incidentally, we've done research on landfill and demonstrated that wood products in landfill essentially last forever in that anaerobic environment. And you combine that with the displacement benefits of the bioenergy and then the displacement benefits of the wood products, you can see that at least in the longer term, the bioenergy system, the forest managed for multiple products, bioenergy and wood products, gives you a greater climate benefit than the forest that is managed to store carbon just in the forest itself. As I mentioned, to reach the net zero goal, the world needs to, to reach the Paris Agreement goal, the world needs to reach net zero in the second half of the century. I've spoken about the ways that bioenergy can reduce emissions, but bioenergy can also contribute to the other side of that balance, contributing to carbon dioxide removal. If you take the flue gases from combusting biomass and then you put them underground through carbon capture and storage, you have essentially a negative emissions system. So you've taken the carbon from the atmosphere when you grew the biomass, you capture it when you combust it, and then you put it underground, leading to negative emissions. We call that BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There's another option that I'd like to mention briefly, which is pyrolysis. Pyrolysis involves heating biomass in a low oxygen environment, and what you produce is two products. You produce a combustible syngas, your renewable energy product, but you also produce a charcoal-like material that we call biochar. If you use it as a soil amendment, you could also call it charcoal and use it as a fuel. But if you put it into the soil, we find that the charcoal, the biochar, is a very stable form of carbon, and it actually lasts in soil for hundreds to thousands of years. So in this way, pyrolysis is a bioenergy option that gives carbon dioxide removal also. In 2018, the IPCC released their special report that was the first report in the 6th assessment cycle, and it looked at how the world could reach this 1.5 degree target. It investigated various pathways to reach 1.5 by the end of the century. This figure shows 4 of the example pathways of the many that they analysed. And most of the pathways that were considered in the special report envisage a substantial role for bioenergy, particularly BECCS, to deliver the carbon dioxide removal that will be required if we continue our emissions intensive lifestyle. So here in grey, you see the emissions. In brown, you see the carbon dioxide removal associated with reforestation. And in yellow, you see the BECCS. So between these different pathways, we go from P1, where the world takes drastic action and we reduce emissions immediately. And in this case, we need only a small amount of afforestation and very little BECCS. All the way through to P4, where we continue our current greenhouse intensive lifestyles. We have a lot of emissions, and therefore we have a big job to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so in this case, we need a lot of BECCS. And the modelling that was done for the special report showed that if this biomass was produced in large blocks of energy crops, this could occupy a large amount of the planet, anywhere from 20 to 720 million hectares of energy crops, if you were to supply the biomass in that way, which, as Flor mentioned, could certainly have detrimental effects on our environment and also on food security. However, there are some win-win options. Biomass production can be integrated into the landscape, integrated with our current forestry and agricultural operations in ways that can actually deliver benefits for agriculture. Trees can be integrated, for example, as shelter belts to protect livestock and crops, as riparian buffers to protect our waterways from runoff, erosion and nutrients. And In this way, you can generate benefits from our biomass, but also you're not going to have detrimental effects on the environment or food production, and in fact, you can enhance it. There are many studies that have been published that demonstrate the benefits of bioenergy for climate change mitigation. This is just a range of papers that have been published by various people who've been involved, many of these in IEA bioenergy over the years. But if you look into the literature, you'll also find that there are a number of scientific papers and reports that claim that bioenergy is in fact detrimental to the climate. These studies emphasize the carbon debt of bioenergy and the long payback time that you may get for forest-based bioenergy. So you might be wondering how it is that different studies give these conflicting results, and how it is that the IPCC has said that bioenergy is so important for climate change mitigation. You may even have heard that bioenergy is worse for the climate than coal. And actually, it's true that if you take a pile of wood pellets and a pile of coal and you simply compare the CO2 emitted, you can get more CO2 per megajoule from the coal, although that's not always the case. But however, that to me would be considering the wrong system boundary if you're looking just at the pile of wood pellets versus coal. So that brings me to the reason why we see that results differ. Firstly, there are legitimate differences due to the very wide range of bioenergy systems, as I described earlier, the range of different feedstocks, technologies, and products, which will naturally lead to differences between studies. But differences can also arise due to the analytical methods chosen by the researcher doing the study, even if they're looking at exactly the same bioenergy systems. And often it's really a subjective choice by the researcher, which can reflect different perspectives, for example, between different disciplinary traditions or different worldviews. So here we have a list of the reasons why we can get differences between the studies. One of the really critical issues is the system boundary that's chosen. If we look just at a forest stand, we can see that the carbon stock goes up and down dramatically when we harvest the forest and then as it regrows. But if we look across the whole landscape, we'll see the total effect of the climate effect on the climate, because a forest is managed as an estate where different parts of it are harvested in each year to provide a continuous supply of wood. So we need to look at the whole forest to see the effect of that forest management on the climate. We need to look also beyond just the biomass and look at the whole bioeconomy. We need to look at the effects of wood products, for example. We need to think about the temporal boundary. Do you start at the time that the trees are planted or at the time the trees are harvested? You'll get a very different answer depending on your choice there. And whether you look at the short term or also look at the long term, the Paris Agreement is targeting the warming at the end of the 21st century. So the contribution of bioenergy to that is what's important from my perspective. Another really critical issue is what you compare it with. To work out the climate effects of bioenergy, you need to compare it with what would happen if we weren't using biomass for bioenergy. Where would we get our energy? What would we do with our land? So it's important that we choose wisely what the appropriate counterfactual would be. And then there are choices about which greenhouse gases we include and other climate forces. So we're thinking here of nitrous oxide and changes in albedo that can both be important for bioenergy systems. And finally, the choice of impact assessment metrics. Normally we use global warming potential, but there are also other choices. Now, there can be valid reasons for alternative choices for the analytical methods that are related to different purposes for the assessments, and researchers should clearly state their approach and ensure it's consistent with the goal and intended application of the study. To conclude, I'd just like to summarize about the importance of the system boundary. If we look just at the smokestack, we're going to miss the fundamental differences between the short and the long carbon cycle. If we look at the forest, we'll miss the important substitution benefits of displacing fossil fuels. If we look at the whole forest, including the smokestack, but we don't look at the wood products sector, we'll miss the substitution benefits there. So we need to look at the whole bioeconomy to understand the climate effects of bioenergy. The points that I've discussed today are all explained in this paper that was published early this year in Global Change Biology, Bioenergy. It was authored by 28 researchers from across the globe, most of whom are involved in Task 45. So I'd encourage you to look at that if you're interested to know more about this. And I'm happy to answer questions by email and also in our discussion. And I can see Klaus, she's turned her camera on because she's hoping that I will get off the screen quite quickly because I've run out of time and I have finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. No, you are correct in your timing. We have been able to keep on our schedule. I'd like to thank you. Trees are indeed this great tool for carbon capture, and combining wood use to modern conversion processes can turn them into this great carbon capture sequestration machine and use. So we can talk more at the Q&A about what's happening in the sector, new funding opportunities, and innovation needs. So after this great initial set of panelists, I'd like to ask our hosts to show the results of our first survey. So we asked, in your country, what do you think most contributes to delaying the growth of bioenergy? And the greatest majority, 51%, point to the lack of or inadequate policy framework. After that, we have high costs of implementation. Again, the talk of funding and investment opportunities. And then I think it is lack of capacity or local infrastructure. Very good points. I'll ask our panelists to think about this survey, and we will comment in the Q&A session. Then I'd like the host to post the next survey for everyone to answer. We'd like to know regarding this issue of deployment of bioenergy and other renewables being associated with initial emissions delaying net reduction. So how long a delay do you think it is acceptable? If you could answer these, we will announce after the next speakers. Okay. Now I'd like to invite my friend Gerard Osheimer. He serves as the co-manager of the Clean Energy Ministerial Biofuture campaign. He's the founder and CEO of the Biofuture Workshop, who will talk about the new Biofuture Platform workstream on sustainability governance and biomass quantification. Gary has been working on the commercialization hurdles of bioenergy for quite some time, quite a lot of experience on policy. So you have the floor.
Glaucia, as ever, it's very good to see you. It's been far too long. Also very nice to see Annette. Clearly lots to talk about there. Looks like the Q&A is already gearing up. So I want to tell you today about a new activity that is going to require an enormous amount of your help and your technical expertise, where you is literally the audience for this talk. And so there's an activity that you have perhaps heard about called the Biofuture Platform. I will tell you a little bit about that. And the Biofuture Platform is an intergovernmental collaboration that has developed a very specific work stream on the availability and sustainability of biomass feedstocks. And so I'd like to tell you about that today. So first, though, I kind of stepping back, and we just had COP 26, if I did the math right. Yes, so I think we just had COP 26. Lots of very public discussion, lots of kind of advertising and branding exercises around the energy transition, around developing a circular economy. All of this is extremely welcome and extremely important. But one of the aspects of this has a new conventional wisdom seems to be emerging regarding the relationship between biomass, the energy transition, and the circular economy. In particular, there have been a number of studies that I will reference some of them. There have been a number of studies from new actors in this space who come to the conclusion that there is, in fact, such a thing as sustainable biomass. And for people that have been observing this sector for a long time, this is a little interesting, because for a long, long time, some of the dominant opinion is, in fact, there is no such thing as sustainable biomass. But now we have very serious people saying that there is such a thing as sustainable biomass, but it's in very limited supply. And so society must think very hard about how we use this very limited resource. And in fact, some are going so far as to say that we should decide in advance what different sources of biomass should be used for, whether that should be for aviation or for chemicals, et cetera. And I just have a word of caution that it's difficult to describe decades in advance what a given resource should be, given that we're also counting on new technologies that are going to help us with our very important climate change mitigation efforts. So the Energy Transition Commission has prepared a very thoughtful and very thorough report on bioresources within a net zero emissions economy. And what they call it Exhibit 1.3, I guess I would have called it Figure 1.3. But in Exhibit 1.3, they kind of pull together this conventional wisdom. And they point out that global supply of sustainable biomass could be between 40 and 60 exajoules a year, of which approximately 10 exajoules from forestry would favor material uses as opposed to, say, combustion. And that would leave 30 to 50 exajoules for energy and industry. And then this is a summary of their calculations. And this estimate is what they refer to as their prudent estimate. One could also call this their conservative estimate. But let's just accept that they have a prudent estimate and they have an illustrative representation where they account for the use of non-food crops. There's a lower range and an upper range. Woody biomass from forestry, again, lower range, upper range. Agricultural residues, municipal and industrial waste, and so then they come up with some total biomass production. They loop in woody biomass for materials, and they come up with this estimate, this range, which is already quite a considerable range, 30 to 50 exajoules. So 30, or we could say 40 plus or minus 10. All right, so the next slide, though, the very next figure from this report is their maximum potential. So now, in fact, in the same report, the ranges vary from, say, 40 exajoules plus or minus 10 to now, we could call it 80 exajoules plus or minus 30. And I show this because I know that these people did the absolute best that they could. And the fact of the matter is there's just an enormous amount of uncertainty in estimates of how much biomass and therefore how much biofuels, bio-based chemicals, bio-based materials are available. And there's a lot of uncertainty because some people might argue we haven't really tried. We haven't tried as hard as we possibly can to sustainably intensify agriculture. And then there's obviously other people who look at the current state of agriculture and they don't want us to try. But, and so there's a real philosophical difference there that's very important. And here they do us, the ETC does us the favor of pointing out that different entities have a great diversity of estimates of the availability of biomass. And this has real implications. So this creates this uncertainty, and the uncertainty about the availability about bio-based fuels and bio-based products has knock-on effects. And it has knock-on effects not just at the supply side, policy side, but also at the demand side. And so say you're a large shipping company and you're trying to think about what you want your ships to burn. And the question is, so you go up to some biofuel company and you say, hey, we hear that you have sustainable biofuel. We understand you've worked very hard to certify it as sustainable. We'd like to buy some. And the biofuel company says, fantastic. And the biofuel, then the shipping company says, well, how much can we buy? And then the biofuel company says, we don't know. It's a maddening result. And so the shipping company is now going off and funding its own research to try to figure out how much biofuel will be available for its ships in 20 years. And so what needs to happen, and so this creates uncertainty. And so as a result, those ships aren't purchased. That demand is not created. The bioeconomy does not move forward. And so the Biofuture Platform has looked at this problem and has looked at the fact that there are many new actors that are entering into this space. And so after Paris, after the sort of global consensus that we need to do a lot of work on decarbonization, a lot of people started looking for solutions. And if you look around, there's a lot of people that look at the bioeconomy for solutions, for opportunities to decarbonize, which has naturally led to concerns that, well, now are we going to be in a resource limited space? Are we going to be worrying about competing uses? And we have all these actors from aviation to maritime to chemicals, other hard to abate sectors that are trying to figure out how much biofuels are going to be available. And so the Biofuture Platform has noted this development in the world, has noted the risks created by uncertainty around the sustainability, governance, and the availability of biomass. And so as a result, the Biofuture Platform that I'll describe to you shortly has leaned in and is trying to engage in this discussion in a very productive way that I will describe. But I just wanted to point out that with these new actors coming in, it kind of creates opportunities and challenge. And one opportunity is it really creates the chance for us to break out of some of the older paradigms that are left over from initial negative experiences with poorly implemented 1G biofuel projects. And if we look, those poorly implemented 1G biofuel projects, those projects are dead. A, they're done, and B, they're old. And C, we've learned an enormous amount and nobody wants to replicate those mistakes. And then the other thing is that, however, is that it's an opportunity to kind of resuscitate these sort of zombie arguments for why the bioeconomy is doomed and fraught from the start. And so we seeking to be evidence-based and technically sound need to engage in this, and the Biofuture Platform wants to convene an intelligent discussion in which all actors are present, whether people that are agnostic, people that are critical, people that are favorable. Can we have can we identify where we agree and where we disagree, and then try to figure out ways to work through our disagreements? That is what we want to do. So let me tell you briefly about the Biofuture Platform. So many of you have probably heard about the Biofuture Platform. Biofuture Platform was created in 2016 at COP22 by the Brazilians. It had 20 countries initially. In 2019, Brazil handed over the secretariat duties to the International Energy Agency. And then last year, the Biofuture Platform actually slotted into the Clean Energy Ministerial as an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. So the Biofuture Platform, which was created as a standalone multilateral effort, is now a multilateral effort within the broader clean energy community of the Clean Energy Ministerial. And so that explains why it has its new logo, and it's described as an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. So about the Clean Energy Ministerial, the SEM, which many people in the bioeconomy are not very familiar with because the SEM has quite naturally been very focused on wind and solar, but we're doing outreach to the community to say that the SEM is the only ministerial level forum that's focused specifically on clean energy. And it's actually, I think, a very positive development that the Biofuture Platform joining the SEM really will attract considerable attention to issues facing the availability and sustainability of biomass. So moving on, as I said, the Biofuture Platform has created a work stream that is known as the Biomass Quantification and Sustainability Governance Work Stream. Quite a mouthful. We're probably going to take recommendations on how to tighten that language. It has a mission, which is to de-risk sustainable feedstocks so that we can accelerate deployment and use of sustainable biomass. We actually have an initial target delivery timeframe where the next meeting of the Clean Energy Ministerial will be next fall in the United States, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we have a scope in which, as I said, we really want to convene stakeholders. We want to document conditions required for biomass feedstocks to provide fuels, chemicals, and materials. And we want to enumerate policies and regulations that minimize waste and increase sustainable biomass production and de-risk biomass use. So I think I'm finishing shortly. I will point out that there is a high-level working group that is driving this process. This high-level working group consists of the United States, which is the chair, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Hungary, India, Netherlands, and Uruguay, excuse me. And we have support from IEA, IRENA, and IEA Bioenergy. And so we are very much looking to engage with the broader IEA bioenergy community and to take all of your decades and collective thousands of years of experience working in this area. And I'm not going to really talk about that. I'm just going to finish with this slide by saying thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation and to point out that I'm not sure that there is I'm sure that there is every task has something to contribute to this international convening effort. And I look forward to working with you all closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Great presentation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. Our next very special duo is Maria Michela Moresi and Uwe Fritsch. Maria Michela Moresi is the Executive Secretary of the Global Bioenergy Partnership at FAO in Italy since its establishment in 2006. And she will start the talk, and then we follow to Uwe. Uwe Fritsch is the Scientific Director of the International Institute for Sustainability Analysis and Strategy in Germany. He leads IEA Bioenergy Task 40 on deployment of biobased value chains and co-leads IEA Bioenergy Task 45 with a focus on sustainability governance. They will talk about governing sustainable bioenergy pathways towards climate goals. Michela, you have the word.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Glaucia, and thank you also for your kind invitation to intervene in this extremely interesting session. And a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants in this session. As Glaucia was mentioning, so I will be focusing on governing systems for sustainability of bioenergy, and Uwe will complement also these initial thoughts. First of all, I would like to highlight a couple of points in terms of numbers, in terms of scenarios that could represent a background for the following discussions, for the following points. So we know from the net zero emission scenarios from IEA, very recently issued, launched, that for sure bioenergy, modern bioenergy is expected to highly contribute to net zero emission scenarios by 2050. And you see here the kind of contribution which is foreseen with respect to 2000 or with respect to 2021, more or less here. So this is an important piece of information. The next important piece of information is that still under the net zero emission scenarios of IEA, it is foreseen that behavioral changes are expected to play an extremely important role in terms of consumption, final consumption, final energy consumption over time. And you see, in fact, how behavioral changes would contribute in terms of, you see here, in terms of bioenergy, modern bioenergy over time. Having said that, we know that bioenergy has a role to play. We've said that. We know that behavioral changes are expected to have an important role. And we also know that modern bioenergy could present opportunities and challenges. And we know that looking at sustainability, focusing on sustainability, we've heard in many of the previous speakers in this session, we've heard how sustainability is key in order to try to take out the best from the opportunities that modern bioenergy could offer. And the Global Bioenergy Partnership has developed a set of sustainability indicators that could support this sustainability assessment. The Global Bioenergy Partnership, which is an international initiative that was established in 2006, has developed over a 4-year activity focusing on sustainability, has developed a set of 24 sustainability indicators that are applicable to any type of bioenergy and are related to the environmental, the social, and the economic performances of any bioenergy value chain. There are a couple of important points here. First of all, you may recognize in this table the set of 24 sustainability indicators, and you also may recognize that these 24 sustainability indicators are equally subdivided under the 3 pillars of sustainable development: environmental, social, and economic. And this wants to be a strong political message in the sense that sustainability can only be achieved if equal importance is paid to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. Once we do this measurement of these sustainability indicators in a country on any type of bioenergy value chain, the data that we collect are important in terms of to be translated into policy recommendations for policymakers in order for them to take informed decisions that could improve the sustainability of the bioenergy performances in the country. This is the report that contains all the 24 methodologies, one for each of the 24 indicators that you've seen on the screen. And another important point is that this kind of sustainability assessment is important that is developed throughout the life cycle assessment, throughout the whole bioenergy value chain. Now, these indicators have been implemented in several countries that you see on the map, but something that I would like really to highlight is the strong commitment that the implementation of these indicators have implied throughout the GBEP membership. And throughout many countries that have accepted and contributed to measure these GBEP indicators in their own country or to support others to do so. And you see on the screen the covers of the many reports with a lot of data collected that have implied the measurement of the GBEP indicators in these many countries. SDGs have been mentioned also by other colleagues in this session, and it's important to highlight that having these set of sustainability indicators, these could be used also as a tool to measure, notify, and verify the achievement of the NDCs, as well as the achievement of the SDGs. And we know that all the SDGs are extremely cross-cutting with respect to the 24 sustainability indicators that I showed before. But it's also true that we cannot look at bioenergy in isolation. We know that the overall demand of biomass under various forms for food, feed, fuel, fiber, and biochemicals is increasing. And if this increase, the same increase also the pressure on natural resources and ecosystem services. So it means that sustainable bioenergy, and again, sustainable bioenergy, has the potential to contribute to sustainable development, but only if this is considered as part of a broader bioeconomy context. And in fact, we have indeed to take into account the trade-offs and the synergies between different demands related to biomass to contribute to the overall sustainable bioeconomy. So it means that integrating biomass conversion for multiple purposes using innovative approaches can have synergistic effects. And on this specific context, on this specific background of the role of bioenergy within the context of a broader bioeconomy, in the context of the Global Bioenergy Partnership, we have developed a report, a specific study that Uwe Fritsche will refer to in the context of his intervention. So I would like to leave the floor now to Uwe to follow up on the basis of this context on bioenergy in the context of the broader bioeconomy. Over to you, Uwe.
Thank you, Michaela, and thank you to the audience. Hello from my side. Just giving you a very, very brief input to the governance issue, which popped up quite often. And let's go ahead. You may be aware, you just saw on the right side the picture on this integrated view of the biomass flows towards services and products. On the left side, you see that the debate about sustainable biomass and the governance is actually not a new one. We already had a very nice physical workshop in Utrecht in 2019, where the summary is shown here. It's available on the IEA Bioenergy website, and I really would recommend to take a look to that one. And part of that was part of the job we had and still have is to look into the governance of the bioeconomy and bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy. And we came up, fortunately, over the last 2 years with a working paper, which kind of synoptically put that into context. And I will not use the time to extract that. That's why we have the paper. You see the link down there where you can download it. And that is kind of a status discussion. And from that, we actually concluded that the initiatives you heard about, the Biofuture Platform and the GBEP, are actually crucial to continue the discussion exchange between countries. Because basically, the current legal system on this planet means that the governance of the bioeconomy and of bioenergy is done on the level of nations, of countries, with very few exceptions, like in the EU, where we have some parts of the bioeconomy, especially the energy part, under the EU legislation. But for all the other countries on this planet, it's an issue of their sovereignty in how you do that. That includes also trade, international trade, which is an issue for bioenergy in many countries, exporting and importing, and it will remain so in the future, maybe even increasing. So how could we deal with that? We have put together some examples, including also certification schemes and many others. So please take a look to this thing, and we will continue working. And that's what I try to give you, the conclusions and the perspectives of that current work. I mentioned already, there is not a one-size-fits-all governance structure. We came up with this famous common but differentiated characterization, also for the sustainability governance. But we need to exchange and coordinate what the countries do and possibly improve jointly. And that means the platforms such as the GWEP are quite important in that. UN organizations, and we have plenty of those, but we mention here FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNDP and UNEP, but also the financial institutions, World Bank and the regional development banks, they have a supporting role. And in the moment, there's a lot of confusion. How could we sustainably deal with biomass, with bioenergy, with biomaterials, with the bioeconomy? And we see a huge task in reducing this noise and come with some, I wouldn't call it a consensus, but an agreed area where we say this makes sense to talk about sustainable biomass, including the use for bioenergy. The Biofuture Platform, you heard that from Jerry, is going to shed some more light on that. GWEP has a few weeks ago agreed to continue in the next year this work, and I'm really happy that this is the case, so we can join forces. And one of the issues is that the GWEP indicators, which are very, very good to have, but they are not enough for the bioeconomy. There are some issues out there which we need to measure and evaluate, and IEA Bioenergy will continue to do work on that, and GWEP colleagues have joined in this discussion, so we can expect an outcome in the not too far future where we say this is the metrics we're gonna apply. So that is, I think, the good news. The other news is that the European Union, through the Joint Research Center, and the USA, in the Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Lab, look also on how could we monitor, not just analyze, not just do LCA, but how could we actually as countries monitor what's going on, including trade. And I think that's another very important thing. If you want to manage sustainability, you need information. And that is something where we also need on the best data we can have, the best practices we can apply, and the will to do so. And that's what we actually mean with governance. So I think we are not really there already, but we are in a good shape to cooperate and elaborate more. And the analytical work from IEA Bioenergy will help to foster that. And I think with that, I will close and thank you for the attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Michela, Uwe, and GWEP partners and collaborators. You have been pioneers in this effort, in this topic of bioenergy and sustainability. You have actual data from countries that are engaging in defining the sustainability indicators. You have the know-how, and you have a great platform for dissemination. So we have something very important to acknowledge here. It's great to hear of your recent add-ons on to this great platform. We now go into the Q&A session. So I ask that all speakers turn their video on, please. And if the host could post the results of the second survey on the screen. We asked about the payback time. We asked about how many years do you think it's acceptable if bioenergy needs to be associated to some delaying of net GHG reductions. And there is the most of the answers say it cannot be decided based on only delay period, since it also depends on the strategic value of the options, for instance, energy security. And the second answer, there's a lot of people that are impatient, less than 10 years, okay? So we need to consider also this question. So my first question to the panel, then we go on to the Q&A questions. Please post your questions to all if you haven't done that yet. Let's go back to the first survey where we asked people to define what were the main barriers for bioenergy expansion in their countries, and the answers were that lack of or inadequate policy framework was the top answer. I think this is directly related to the second and third options that won, the high costs of implementation and the lack of capacity or local infrastructure. This may also be related to a policy framework or economics. So I'm gonna ask the opinion of each of the panelists. Who wants to go first? Bruno, you talked about sustainable development goals. How do you see these answers in this context? How can we relate the lack of inadequate policy, lack of capacity, and high costs of implementation to the fulfillment of the sustainable development goals?
Yeah, maybe I can talk from a Canadian perspective, since this is what I know more about. Of course, if you look at the affordability implications in terms of affordable clean energy, but also the linkages with poverty, with competitiveness of industry in other SDGs, the fact that you are trying to replace, at least in Canada, very cheap fossil fuels, natural gas, way cheaper here than maybe in Europe or other countries, or other more polluting fuels, with bioenergy, sure explains why maybe we don't have more bioenergy in Canada, even though we have a lot of resources maybe to use. And something that might help in terms of policy is going to be increasing carbon price. So we have the ambition to have carbon pricing up to $170 a ton in 2030, and this drastically changes the economics or how bioenergy is going to be able to compete with fossil fuels. I mean, it's not like the $10-20 a ton context we're talking about. It's really like really high carbon prices going forward, and who knows what's going to be beyond 2030. So this might be something that's going to change how bioenergy competes. And the other element was infrastructure. Again, it ties into SDGs around sustainable communities and cities. We see it's difficult to have a large share of renewable heat or bioheat or other sources in cities without district energy infrastructure. And if you compare in Canada what's in place with what other European countries have, and countries with similar climate, so the more you have this infrastructure to mobilize different heat sources, including bioenergy, in an urban context, the more you can have those renewable shares increase, And if you instead rely on a grid of natural gas distribution, then natural gas will remain the most prevalent energy source for building heat in cities, as we see now in Canada. So those might be initial thoughts.
Okay, Flor, do you want to comment how can the synergies and trade-offs play in this decision of what is the most prevalent barriers? What are your opinions?
Thank you, Claudia. So when I was filling out the poll, I was thinking, oh, we can only select 3 because I want to select all of them because I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think they're all interrelated. And I think it starts with what we have discussed today, that there are indeed risks on negative impacts on the SDGs, although there are also positive impacts, but there are risks of negative impacts and we cannot neglect those. And this leads to large uncertainties, and it leads to uncertainties in the public opinion and therefore a lot of opposition. And it also leads to hesitation, I think, with policymakers to push for it. And therefore there's no clear policy framework. And this uncertainty and uncertainty in the policy framework also results in that there's a lack of investment from the industry. So I think that all combines together that therefore it's a big barrier for bioenergy to be implemented. So I hope that with these kind of sessions that we can have a bit more clarity on the sustainability and what are the risks, but also how we can avoid those risks, and therefore help also to steer towards the sustainable use, that we are more confident about how we can do it sustainably. And I think that could enable to have also a clearer policy framework and therefore also investments in bioenergy. And by investing in bioenergy, it can also reduce the cost. So I think in that regard, they are all interrelated.
Okay, thank you, Flor. Annette, do you want to contribute to this barriers? What do you think could be the most, I think, exacting barriers in the forestry GHG emissions mission? We need to use forests. So how can we do it sustainably? What are the barriers?
Yes, thank you, Glacia. The others have mentioned the features that are relevant also in Australia. I looked at the list and had trouble choosing. Actually, there was the option that I wanted wasn't there, which was people forget it altogether. It's just not on the radar in Australia. But I picked the 3 that have come out on top. And it's, as Flor described, it's a lack of confidence. And another point that's important is the lack of confidence also comes from, it's too complex, there's all these different technologies, different feedstocks. It's hard to get your head around. It's hard to devise policy that can cover all those different options. And I guess policymakers are recognizing that there are a range of outcomes, and therefore it's necessary to come up with policy that can be more clever. It needs to be able to distinguish those options that give the better climate benefits from those that don't, and those that give the better SDG benefits from those that don't. And so that all makes for a complex environment in devising policy that's going to be effective. So at least in Australia, policymakers think, oh, that's too hard, let's just focus on wind and solar. And also we have this chicken and egg thing, as you described, Glacia. If you don't have the confidence, if you don't have the policy, then you don't get the investment. And if you don't get the investment, then you don't get the capacity building. And so it just stays minimal whilst wind and solar expands. So I think it's important to encourage policymakers to recognise the strategic contribution that bioenergy can make, that I spoke about, that can actually support their objectives in terms of enhancing the wind and solar capacity, and to encourage them to think broader than the very narrow, just the biomass. Think about the way bioenergy contributes to the whole of, well, not just the energy system, but the whole of the bioeconomy, so that they can actually understand the full benefits that bioenergy can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it, Annette. We have complexities to address. Perhaps we need to inform our policymakers in the specific context that they have to agree we are, I think, overloading on information regarding many of the things that do not apply at the local context that we need to deploy bioenergy. Sometimes we are overthinking perhaps on all these issues, and look at the context, look at the local efforts that might be deployed immediately. I would like to see that we focus policy immediately on the low-hanging fruits. They are there. We have lots of things that are already working, as you yourself mentioned, and many others in this session. So I asked to my rescue, Gerard, because you have been working these complexities and in many different industries, I understand. So how do you deal with this? How do you deal with these barriers? We have 3 top barriers to think of, but I agree with our panelists. We should have been able to click on all the buttons, but it's good to have 3. Let's focus on those 3.
Well, I'm not sure how I feel about the fact that I'm your solution to people that like think about all the problems, so that I'm going to be the, I'm the person to dumb it down. I'm not sure how I feel about that. But what I will say is the following. Instead of looking at, the ongoing challenges, let's look at, there's sort of, and I talked about them earlier, but not in detail. There's 2 situations where every drop is going to be purchased. Every drop of biofuel is going to be purchased. One situation is renewable diesel in the state of California. Every drop is getting purchased. The other is in SAF, right? So sustainable aviation fuels. Every drop that's being made, somebody's buying that. That means that there's a customer, right? So what's happening in California, and I'll just focus on renewable diesel because it might be a little less in the news. But basically, you have situations where it's an effortless purchase. So it's not blended. It's a straight drop-in fuel. So as you were saying, people, as Fleur pointed out and others, people don't want to deal with the complexity, right? So very simple, you can just use it automatically. But then the question is like, well, do people believe that it's contributing to NDCs, SDGs, et cetera? Of course, that's not how they phrase it. They just want to know, is it green, right? So is it green? And for the moment, right? So for the moment, essentially all, well, I don't know this, but much of that renewable diesel is coming from used cooking oil or from certified oil feedstocks, right? Which like really kind of safer feedstocks. So it's very easy for big companies, Apple, Starbucks, whatever. They just buy the fuel and then they tell the world. They use biofuel as an example of how green they're being. And that's the situation we want to get to. That's where, for the consumer, we just eliminate the complexity. It's like, oh, I trust Starbucks. They're using this. I'll use it, right? And then likewise, oh, I don't need to change it. I don't need to blend it. I don't need to change my refinery. I don't need to change anything. I just use it. That's what they want, right? And even with electrification, and we need every electron we can get as fast as we can possibly get, right? There should be no conflict between electrification and its cousin hydrogen and the bioeconomy. We need them both at the same time, as fast as we can, with them all being sustainable. But if you look at EV, where do people have problems? People have problems with the fact that, oh, I have to have a charger and a battery. It's like if people have to change, then they have a problem. And so it requires leadership, and it requires clarity, and it requires customer buy-in. But the customer buy-in doesn't have to be for the individual person. The customer buy-in should start with fleet users. Let's just talk about fuels. Should start with fleet users, because then people like, I trust Coke. I drink Coke. I trust Starbucks. I trust this. oh, okay, well, they use it, they say it's good, then I'll believe in it. That's why electrification has gone so far so fast, because it's had a lot of allies. And so I think there's some lessons to be learned there. I know I didn't answer your question. I reframed it, sorry.
That's okay, thank you. Very, very illuminating. So I give my challenge to Michela. Michela, what do you think are the greatest barriers?
Thank you, Glosia. Well, I would like to echo a bit what also other colleagues have mentioned. So I would say that a couple of issues are very key for me to be taken into consideration. On one side, the lack of adequate policies, but in particular, the lack of adequate stable policies are important. And this is strictly related to somehow the lack of trust by investors if policies are not stable. So those two elements are strictly connected one each other. Another point which is very important is data collection. And data collection is a real issue. I mean, it's a real barrier, in particular in some specific countries. We have implemented the GBEP indicators in several countries, and data collection, availability of data is always one of the starting point which represents an issue, which represents a problem. So data collection, of course, is important. The more we collect data related to the bioenergy value chain, the better it is, because of course we have the possibility to do pre-feasibility assessments to identify what are the barriers and how to overcome these barriers. And of course, at the end of the data collection, we could suggest policy and give policy recommendations so that policymakers could be informed, could take informed decisions, could improve their policies, and therefore improve the trust of investors in these investments. I would not necessarily see the cost of the investment as a barrier, because I've seen also examples of pioneering investors developing important plans, but having failed in doing a pre-feasibility assessment of the biomass resource availability beforehand. So not always the cost is an issue, but it's important to do it in a very strategic manner. So those are my points. Thank you.
Okay. Michela, I am very glad you mentioned the need for data, the need for harmonized, official, transparent data sources. I think this would meet also points that Gary raised regarding how much biomass is out there that can be sustainably sourced and over a long time. So there is a need to integrate many countries into this equation, because there are many countries who are producing biomass that could be used in a more modern way. And I give you an example. In Brazil, for instance, we need to map the value chains of the Amazon. This is something that is on course now, and it's extremely hard to do. We need, among all the industries that operate in the tropics, to have their value chains mapped, so that the industry themselves know what's going on, where and how much, and how can it be done better. So we don't have these open access platforms. This could be something to address in a research platform as well that could reach different countries. So this could be something that could help mapping, using the universities and the research centers in each country to contribute to open sources of data. And Uwe, I give you the last word. So what are your thoughts on the barriers?
Well, one thing, which is an observation from my side, which is shared by many colleagues, is the challenge of the sustainability equation and the pillars, or whatever you want to call it, is the integration. That policymakers cannot deal with 17 goals, which are partly conflicting, and 200 and something more indicators. That doesn't work. And so there is little innovation in the policy, in the governance approaches we have, because we are used to, and our institutions are shaped to address sectoral considerations. There is agro, the whole agronomic sector, there's a forestry folks, there's waste people, there's energy people, there are material folks, and the material is completely disaggregated. And we have to come up, I really think that, with innovative approaches on how to govern complex systems. And they're not just complex, they're also dynamic. If you look to the relative cost of renewable energies 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that has changed radically. And the cost of storage will change radically over the next 10 and 20 years. So that's a huge dynamic. And I have two niches of hope, I should say. One is the European Union has started to come up with a rather good compact. They call it the Green Deal, which tries to integrate under the broader umbrella of the SDGs all kinds of policies and integrate them. That you have biodiversity, climate change, energy, land use, forestry, and now even consumerism, even products along the supply chains. That's an ambitious approach, and it's not easy to bring 27 countries under that logic, but it's worth as an experiment. And the second part is the taxonomy, an approach to bring a financial framework which gives clarity what are green investments. And I think we should really try to help the Commission and others and member states and people outside of Europe to build on that. I know there is a discussion about a Green Deal in the United States. We have in many Asian countries Green Deals up there. And I think that is something we should look. Is there a comprehensive policy package where you can ease the problem of complexity? And also the management logic to say the data issue you mentioned, that we need to review the policies, not every 10 years or 20, but every couple of years to take a look, do we really achieve what we want? And that's where the monitoring system, the data intense issues are so crucial. And here, I guess, we can really take a bit on the remote sensing technology, which is quite improving. And for all land-based systems where biomass is concerned, there is a lot we can learn. The sensors we can have also in the agricultural soils. The US is doing groundbreaking work in that regard. So the data availability will be less a problem, and the cost of data. It's organizing, having the integration and the sharing approach of data. That's, I guess, the two challenges: to integrate policies into larger packages under the SDGs or similar frameworks. And the Green Deal approach is a good one. We should take a good look here. The bioeconomy can be part of that. We will see how next year, when the Commission reviews its bioeconomy strategy, to what extent we can bring that in. And the bioenergy part is already integrated. I think that's quite important to diffuse the uncertainty a little bit on the policy level. Analytically, data provision and access, open access is crucial as well. That's my 2-cent take on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Uwe. Now we go into the Q&A session with the audience. I have a question here from Keith Klein. Nice to see you here, Keith. Keith is asking regarding governance. Is there progress to consider bioenergy in more integral manner as part of larger systems, and as such apply the same sustainability criteria to all products and all human natural resource management activities? Who wants to answer this? Uwe. Michela. Okay, let's start there.
This time I'm starting, and Michela, you follow up, right? What I mentioned, this more or less innovative approach of the Green Deal is one opportunity to bring that integration into the real life of politics. It's not perfect, right? But it's a worthwhile approach we should try to evaluate. And I think that's a way forward. But clearly that is not for all products. It is for a certain subset. But bringing the financial sector into the game, I think that's really a game changer. So in my view, we have made progress and we should substantiate that. And Keith, I know you're in a position to also help the US to make similar reflections. And I think there's a good bridge for a transatlantic exchange on these kind of things. And we have Asian partners who look into that with a similar approach. Unfortunately, Africa is missing. And I think that is one of the, in my view, the things that we have to look to a resource-rich country, and the governance there should be supported. So I have some hopes that we can get better on that, but at least theoretically, it's still something we have to deal with.
Okay, Michela?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. Bioenergy per se is already a very complex issue and is extremely cross-cutting with respect to any other sorts of renewable energy. And this means that already foreseeing a sustainability set of indicators, a sustainability assessment considerations for bioenergy means that you are already having an holistic approach in the sense that you are looking at the production, transformation, and end use of a product. This is, of course, strictly connected to the life cycle assessment that I mentioned before, to the whole bioenergy value chain that I mentioned before, that goes a lot beyond also the bioenergy per se. So this is extremely important. And on the other side also, still regarding governance, something extremely important is also to familiarize countries, governments, policymakers regarding the importance of sustainability, the importance of sustainable bioenergy. And on this, I would like to mention something that the GBEP contributed to in around 2011, 2012, so some years back, but extremely important, was to support the ECOWAS countries, the 15 countries of the ECOWAS region, which is the northwest part of Africa, to develop a strategy on bioenergy because before that work that we did, and that we tried also to facilitate a transition from traditional use of bioenergy towards a more modern use of bioenergy. Before our work in that region, there was a kind of a suspicious way of looking at bioenergy, in terms only of challenges and not of opportunities. So for governance is important to look also at those kind of considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Michela. Gerard.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at Keith's question. And, you know, essentially, I think what Keith is describing is a scenario where governments, companies, finance understands that there is a global carbon budget, right? And so there is already, you know, I think there's I forget the name of it, but there's the activity where, you know, we get to the day of the year where we've actually consumed all of our annual resources, except that day is not December 31st. That day is like August 7th or something terrible. And so people are coming to understand that because of public attention to COP, because of other efforts around sustainability, people are understanding that we have a finite, thank you, Craig. We have a finite resource base, and that we should be thinking systematically and holistically. And so when people talk about like, well, we can only emit so much carbon until we overshoot, and then we get, you know, 1 million degrees warming, et cetera. This is all to the good. Whether it's going to result in behavior change fast enough is what we need to worry about. But you know, there's going to be this continuous wrestling, and then we've seen this all the way back to GBEP and beyond, and we see this even today, where individual countries are very hesitant about restricting their own economic development. And I think until we see more even development across the world, it's going to take a long time to get to that global consensus on a global carbon budget. But I mean, clearly that's where we want to be. But in the interim, we can be developing all of those metrics. We can be developing those data sources, and we can get much more and more sophisticated. And even Uwe brought up Africa, where we can be engaging with leaders, and we need to take it the next step. And so that people can figure out how to make money, how to make a living off of being greener than the next guy. And I think that's where we need to get to. And that's going to require entrepreneurship. That's going to require ambition. That's going to require leadership. And hopefully we're starting to see these things percolate around the world.
Thank you. And to finish, I would like comments on the results of our second survey. Annette, perhaps you can take that up, the payback time from using forest systems. How can we expect to have a return from the use of forests? And to that, I would also like to ask if you could comment a question from Bas. Nice to see you here, Bas Huckels. He's asking if we should accept that bioenergy will have some negative effects. So how can we deal with the negative effects, and how much is acceptable?
Thank you, Glaucia. Yes, this is a very tricky question. How long is too long for a payback time? And there isn't an easy answer. My presentation focused on the need to take a full systems view of bioenergy in order to understand its climate effects. So I would remind people of that. And so looking very narrowly at just the system of the biomass production and its combustion doesn't give you the whole answer. You need to consider how bioenergy actually changes the way we do things. If you can use bioenergy instead of building a new fossil fuel plant, then you need to consider in your counterfactual the fact that you would have produced this new fossil fuel plant, and you need to include that within your system boundary. And you need to think about the effect of having an incentive for bioenergy on people's choices for land uses. There have been studies that have demonstrated that the existence of a bioenergy market has encouraged people to maintain land under forests where it might instead have been cleared. So you need to look also at the socioeconomic implications of your policies to be able to understand that question of the contribution of bioenergy. And that way you can see how bioenergy can actually contribute to climate change mitigation now and also in the future, because we need to make sure that our decisions now don't lock us in to choices that actually restrict our choices in the future or cause longer term emissions that we may miss if we have a very short term focus. I know this is a complicated answer, and it even gets more complicated because if you look at the IPCC report, you see that there are many different pathways in order to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. And so many of the pathways actually involve short-term emissions and then longer-term reductions in emissions and carbon dioxide removal. Many of the strategies that we need to take in order to deliver climate change action do involve short-term emissions. So for example, if you want to put in a new railway line in Australia, the most common flight route is from Sydney to Melbourne. It only takes an hour. If we had a very fast train, everybody would prefer to do that. But if you're going to put in a train line, this is going obviously to require a great deal of emissions in the whole process. And these are some of the things that people tend to miss when they're thinking of other options, but they focus on when they're thinking about bioenergy. So we had some discussion on the global carbon budget. Thank you, Jerry. And what we need to work out is how bioenergy occupies the global carbon budget. And if bioenergy is part of a sustainable system, it actually behaves more like a short-term climate faucet because it's emitted and then it's taken back out again. So it in fact doesn't occupy the global carbon budget, the remaining carbon budget, if it's part of that short-term carbon cycle. I'm sorry, it's a complicated answer, but that's how I see it.
And yeah, that's how it is, unfortunately, but we are making great progress in clarifying these issues. So Flor and Bruno, I want to ask for your final inputs to any of the questions that you saw posted so far. Flor, can you give us your final words?
I just want to echo just what Annette just mentioned. And also, we have very strong reduction targets, indeed, on the very short term. But climate change doesn't stop by 2030 or 2050, right? So we have to also take into account this longer term vision. And I do think, indeed, that bioenergy can play a role in that. But we have to do it sustainably. And I agree with you, Claudia, that we have to go for the low-hanging fruit. So we can do the calculations for many centuries more. But we also have to get started, right? We have to get going. So I would suggest indeed to start with the low-hanging fruit. So the things that we are certain about that can be done sustainably, start with that and go from there. So that would be my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Flor. And Bruno?
I also agree with what Annette provided in terms of an answer. Maybe pointing to research that was done recently in Canada on the trade-offs between having conservation in forests and using them to provide multiple products in different sectors. So the carbon fluxes of parks in Canada, so national parks, were studied over time by our team at the Forest Service here in Victoria, British Columbia. And they found that earlier in the late 1900s, so 1990, so those parks were actually carbon sinks. But as they become older, as they become impacted by different pests or by wildfire, the conservation only won't provide you those benefits on the long term. Those forests will revert back to being sources of emissions. And so there's a rationale for managing forests in an intelligent manner, transferring some of the carbon into the built environment, and what you cannot use for those higher value applications, then you can also use for bioenergy to divert higher carbon intensity fuels. So it seems in the short term, it always seems better to some people to just leave a tree grow because you see carbon accumulating in that tree. But when you look at the landscape level, it actually makes more sense usually to use the forest and of course conserve some portions of it, but also manage in a sustainable manner other portions of it so you can transfer that carbon in the built environment, carbon that could be released anyways because of pests or because of wildfires that we're seeing more and more in Canada and other places across the world.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, I think we have finished. I'd like to thank all panelists for their great presentations. It's always good to have these opportunities to share our results, our ideas, and collaborate in this effort. I'd like to thank Joran Benz for the invitation to chair this session, our colleagues at Task 45, and the other tasks that we collaborate with, and GBEP, and hope to see you all soon in the next sessions of the IEA-TCP conference 2021. Thank you for your audience, and thank you for all your questions.